Pokemon is one of the biggest franchises in the world with plenty of merchandise, which also includes games. Though, when content eventually runs out, there's only one option left. Dive into the sea of games made by the community for new journeys. But like with any games made by fans, the quality of the end result can be quite unpredictable. Now, all of this just leads to a single thought. What truly is the worst fan creation? I'll go over the main list of contenders for the worst, then end off with the one truly bad ROM hack. So, let's get the ball rolling. A title that's popped up for many reasons, Clover has definitely taken the cake when it comes to the title of the most polarizing ROM reception-wise. Though that's not what we are discussing today. If you're someone who's easily offended, then this would be one of the worst ROM hacks for you. But if you're someone who tends to lean more into the dark humor aspect of things, while possibly browsing the site that pretty much all of its creators have lurked on, then I would also understand you calling it one of the best. Hell, there's even some moments that anyone can have a laugh at. Though, knowing that I would have people comment about it being one of the worst hacks out there, regardless of my points or comments, I can understand where people with those types of thoughts are coming from. And if it weren't for the surprising amount of effort, the great looking sprites, and attention to the graphics and details, the placement on this list for Clover would be much easier to decide. Yet, even with being able to look past the raunchiness and appreciate the quality, there still ended up being some stuff that still made me raise some eyebrows. So when it comes to the offensiveness category, I can understand people dubbing it as the worst when it comes to that. However, in a world where Clover existed as an inoffensive, clean version that many would usually expect from a Pokemon hack, then possibly even topics of it being one of the best fan-made Pokemon games would seem realistic. But on the other hand, that would take away its sinister charm that gives it uniqueness in the first place, leading us to the same result as initially. So, for what it is as we know it, and seeing where people could come from when it comes to the game's topics, it ends up here on this list for that exact reason. Though, believe me, it's nowhere close as cookie cutter in the sense of being clearly horrible when comparing to what comes next. Barely squeaking by, being considered so bad it's good for some, it's still mostly infuriating with a lot of edginess and annoying stuff like grinding and unbalanced battles. But for some of those exact reasons on the opposite can be enjoyable. Though more than not, it can be really unfair, tedious, and worst of all, having an interesting premise behind it, with a plot based around an apocalypse scenario in the Pokemon world. Yet it all falls flat even before you get the equivalent of the first gym badge. As for what makes it more bearable than the rest, the game presents you with a medium-sized cast of Fakemon, which always makes any sort of hack slightly more entertaining due to taking advantage of what made Pokemon big in the first place. The magical feeling of adventure and discovery of brand new creatures. If that doesn't tickle your quality-depraved fancy, the game also stands right in the middle between two serious and goofy dialogue, giving it that feeling of being the Pokemon's version of Birdemic, or The Room, or just a car crash that you can't help but look at. But in this case, having a bit more understanding enjoyment out of it. Now, I know you may be thinking about what a tragedy this would be if it didn't have the so bad it's good element attached to it, even though it is mostly still horrendous if you're the one playing, with things like an unfair Dark Ghost type Wonder Guard boss, or very needlessly irritating puzzles. But what if it could be still that much worse? A name that most likely you have came across in various forms, the ever so unbeloved Dark Rising is an unfortunately similar case to Snakewood, yet it pushes its edginess to the extreme and takes itself too seriously while having unfair difficulty, which would be already bad enough if it weren't for the at points unbearable dialogue. Now, keeping in mind that the creator was literally 12 or 13 years old at the time of this ROM's creation, some of its unpleasant parts become more understandable. Though none of these tearings or anything I say is meant to be an attack on the creator. Hell, the best I could do at 13 when it comes to this was poorly tracing an image of my own Fakemon, so I'll keep my mouth shut. Until the first place ROM comes up. But before that comes, the separated art from the artist by the name of Dark Rising still usually ends up dealing damage to one's psyche with the worst case of grinding syndrome I've ever seen and will ever see, having unexpected, over-leveled boss trainers that usually have stall-based Pokemon in the midst of things not helping things either. And if you ever were able to get out of the pits of leveling up misfortune, you just as easily could step into the pit right next to it, which is known as glitches up the wazoo. If you manage to get through the mind-melting adventures of misery-filled hours, there still can be things that could give you a hint of enjoyment. Either is the dialogue itself that makes it weirdly entertaining, having Pokemon that usually be locked to the endgame be accessible quite early, or just an unusually difficult challenge that you're feeling kind of curious to take on. Nonetheless, a ROM of this caliber is still impressive for a 12 to 13-year-old's creation, hence not reaching a worse rating than the one now. Even with all of the pointers that could push the case in Dark Rising's favor, it still would seem the most likely to end up staying here either way. Though, one thing makes me quite curious. I wonder what the dev, aka Dark Rising girl, thinks of her work years later. Well, for starters, she probably would think that at least it wasn't as bad as this next game. Despite its reputation, the only thing that makes it somewhat good is the time capsule nature of being a ROM made 20 years ago and the status of being one of the first ROMs on a cartridge, or just one of the first ROMs overall, though that doesn't excuse it from being shoddily coded. Being possible to only get to the first badge, the original version of Chaos Black prevented you from actually getting invested in the ROM, more specifically being unable to get even past Mount Moon due to surf tiles that obstructed your path. Now, there's a chance that this was done intentionally as a sort of a method for making it a demo of the full version, but we can only speculate. Unless you found your ways around the issue with the good old walkthrough wall sheet to solve the issue in no time, the only way of experiencing the poorly made hack was to play it when a fan eventually fixed it, while adjusting some other slight errors alongside it. To be honest, the fix might have just made it worse by making it impossible to save. But that may be just me or the emulator I used. Besides the story having less effort into it than anyone in the bathroom with diarrhea, also a fitting title for the ROM by the way, The last saving grace of adding new designs as catchable Pokemon ends with an anticlimactic finish.
Hold it!
When not taking long at all to realize that the majority of them are just reskins with minuscule changes added to them. Just think of the comparison between DP and BDSP, but in Pokemon form, and you'll get a good idea of what I mean. Ever seen the guy on the box art or the title screen? Yeah, me neither. Because of course, they never appear or exist in the game in the first place. Remember that one rock guy with the cut off legs? Or the popular hoax Fakemon Mewfree? Yeah, turns out they were just Cloyster and Moltres with Imposter as their ability all along. And if it didn't fail hard enough already by failing to offer a new experience outside the official games, or at the very least making a Pokemon game you can legitimately beat, it wanted to be what Emerald is to Ruby and Sapphire, but for Fire Red and Leaf Green instead. Yet like everyone probably expected, it just ends up being the poor man's replica of the shift from Twitter to X when we judge it by those terms. Well, some of the designs it presented have become iconic or memeable in their own ways, which I guess does make them somewhat better than the first place holder. But if we're being honest, nothing's ever outperforming it as the worst trash ever. What can be a worse game than making something horrible that everyone despises and completely avoids? Well, something that's very bad and not even made by you in the first place. As it was quickly discovered by the place that somehow always has part-time detectives, Reddit soon called out the ROM hack creator for stealing their Fakemon sprites. From where, you may ask? Oh, just from a project with a following that was worked on by passionate developers. No big deal. The best part is that Thief not only took them without permission, but also threw shade at them in the now deleted announcement post of the ROM hack. Even better, the game was just Fire Red with very minimal quality of life changes besides the stolen roster of the amazing sprites by the Pokemon Pro Scion Deneb devs. We already have constant tension of Nintendo breathing down our necks with ROM hacking as a whole, so having people stealing from each other in this community just seems so disappointing to see. Just do better, man. But before the absolute worst, here are some dishonorable mentions. Good old profanity. Now, in small, rare doses it can be quite funny if it's done correctly, yet when the game relies on it to make it unique or build itself all around it, then I'm sure you can get an idea of what it's like. The same goes for hacks like Cops and Outlaw, but at the end of the day they're not as horrible as any other. On top of that, at least they put in a bit more effort and added features like a new map or smaller yet unique things that could make the games playable and at some points even enjoyable. Ending up here solely if you take the term worst as literally as possible, Vietnamese Crystal is riddled with horribly translated text and hilariously bad grammar. Yet for those exact reasons, it easily is a so bad it's good ROM hack. And especially since you most likely know what you're getting yourself into if you decide to boot a hack up, it's hard to call it bad when the only thing bad about it is being literally just Pokemon Crystal, yet with goofy, wacky text and dialogue in place of the original. Unless you despise Gen 2. Then it's a whole different conversation. Last one before heading into the definition of foul, Pokemon is one of the earliest ROM hacks ever created, even outdating the likes of Chaos Black. So, on the note of being the first truly bad ROM, Pokemon easily takes the cake with no hassle. Yet it's such a nothing burger once again needlessly offensive game that it's not worth your time, even if it's just to see how a hack of that age looks and plays like. We've gone over offensive, painfully edgy, unbalanced, and other reasons for being worthy of being called bad. So, what is something that takes all of them on and still easily outranks them? Well, my dear viewer, if you've never heard of this hack before, the only thing I can say is that I'm jealous of you, and I'm sorry that I'm about to take away your blissful ignorance. Going by the name of Pokemon Psychic Adventures, the hack presents you with the opportunity of using Drowsy as a starter. Now, I know it doesn't sound that bad on paper, but what you end up achieving with the Pokemon's powers is a whole different story. If the Hypno line didn't already have enough on their plate with trying to wash out one's Hypno's misdeeds to their reputation, this hack isn't really looking to help those matters. As you quickly learn, if you're unfortunate enough to end up playing it, Drowsy's Hypnosis and Psychic can be used for much more nefarious purposes than anyone reasonable would suspect. If you're on a high enough level, you get opened up to options that, let's just say, would make you pop up on a list for inappropriate, unconsenting activities. Oh, but don't worry, the dev quickly mentioned at the start that all of the characters are 18 years old, so your butt is covered there. And no worries about any kids playing, because they put in a yes-no question about your age. So I'm sure no kid that easily can access this will ever lie. Just to make sure, I still tested it by saying no, and I'm sure that you can guess the result. And of course, the whole game revolves around this lovely concept, like you might expect, having it be pretty much the only change presented. Unless you count having May as your rival in this game and having new, yet unbearably cringe dialogue right from the get-go be a positive thing. Better yet, you have the option of not picking Drowsy as the starter, which defeats the whole purpose of the hack that shouldn't exist in the first place. And if you do, the dev just insults you for not picking it by taunting you with nagging messages and straight up blocking you from continuing instead of not being a lazy ass and just removing the other options. So yeah, even though previous hacks on the list have been pretty booty cheeks in their own regards, I would take a buggy, boring, and unfair mess any day over picking this and having that on my consciousness for the rest of my life. And don't misunderstand me, on top of all the previous shit, this trash is still game-breakingly glitchy at points. While hoping that we're on the same note here, I see no reason as to why we shouldn't crown Psychic Adventures as the worst ROM out there. So please, if you have any respect for yourself, never touch or play this hack. But besides that, thank you dear lovely patrons, and I suggest you check that out too. Follow me on Twitter for extra stuff, and thanks for tuning in. See ya!